She arrived with her head lowered, her past trailing behind her in silence, marked by bruises, betrayal, and 3 loyal hens as the only witnesses to the life she left behind. Sold as a debt, labeled as property, forgotten by the world. But Clara was never meant to be forgotten. In a land ruled by men with quick tempers and loaded rifles, there are still those like Ezra McKinnon, men who carry honor in their eyes and mercy in their hands. Here, freedom isn't handed over. It's earned, fought for, chosen. Through fire and fear, with rifle in hand and chickens by her side, Clara finds something worth more than gold or vengeance: dignity, purpose, and a name that no longer has to hide. This isn't just a tale of revenge or romance. It's a reckoning. It's about identity, about courage, about choosing the life no one else chose for you. This is not just the West you know. This is the West reborn. This is Souls of the Old West. The sun bore down hard on the dusty town of Calico Junction, but Clara didn't flinch. She sat on the wooden platform with her legs folded beneath her, and her arms wrapped protectively around a wicker basket that held 3 white hens, Philo, Carillo, and Amora. Their quiet clucking was the only familiar sound in a town where every stare made her skin crawl. Her dress, once sky blue, had faded to the color of ash, torn at the hem and stained from travel and labor. Her pale skin had turned ruddy from months sobbing into sunlight, and her once delicate hands were now rough and freckled. The auction crowd buzzed with idle curiosity and raw hunger, not for livestock, but for spectacle. Clara tried not to meet their eyes, afraid of what she'd see reflected there. Her father's debt to Hartwell, the town's moneylender, had reached its breaking point, and when the old man died, all that was left was Clara. She wasn't property, but the law in Calico had always made space for flexible interpretation when women were involved. Hartwell stood beside her, a slip of paper in hand, barking out the terms like he was selling a mule. Strong arms, capable of labor, and quiet disposition. He didn't mention the hens, her only real family, but she kept them close anyway, because if she lost them too, there'd be nothing left. The first bid came from a man in a brown hat and a beard stained with tobacco. $20, he said with a grin that made Clara's stomach churn. Hartwell grunted, dissatisfied. Do I hear 30? He called out. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman, even one who carried 3 hens in a basket, was worth more than 20. Jeremiah Slade's voice cut through the crowd like a knife. 50, he said lazily, sitting atop his black stallion like he owned the whole damn territory. The crowd shifted, some men elbowing each other knowingly. Slade didn't bid for cooking help or cleaning hands. Everyone in Calico knew what he used women for in the Red Rose Saloon. Clara felt a rush of cold sweat run down her spine. She gripped the handle of her basket tighter, her thumb brushing over the soft feathers of Philo, who stirred beneath the cloth. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not here. Not now. Slade's gold tooth caught the sunlight as he smiled at her, and Clara looked away, unable to stomach the suggestion in his expression. If he won the bid, she'd spend her life serving whiskey with painted lips and dead eyes, a puppet in some smoky, sour theater she couldn't escape. 75, said a voice she didn't recognize, calm, low, and firm. The crowd turned, their bodies parting instinctively. Out of the dust stepped a tall, sun-browned man with gray eyes and a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were plain, canvas trousers, a threadbare coat, worn leather boots. But there was a steadiness in the way he stood, a kind of quiet certainty that hushed the square. Clara blinked and looked up. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't watching her the way the others did. He wasn't watching her at all, in fact. His eyes were fixed on Hartwell, and his hand rested near his belt, not near a holster. Ezra McKinnon, someone whispered. Rancher up past Pine Creek. Slade's smirk tightened. 100, he countered, louder now, his tone no longer amused. Ezra didn't hesitate. 150. Gasps fluttered through the crowd like dry leaves in wind. That was more than anyone had ever offered for a person in Calico Junction. Hartwell stared at him like he'd grown antlers. Clara's breath caught. She didn't understand what was happening, but it felt like the tide of something shifting. Ezra finally looked at her, really looked, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't hunger or pity. It was recognition, a quiet nod, a small gesture, but to Clara it felt like a door cracking open. 200, Slade growled, his posture shifting just slightly in the saddle. His black horse stomped restlessly beneath him. The crowd murmured again, now watching not just a sale, but a duel of sorts, pride, power, and coin battling in plain daylight. Clara stared at the man named Ezra, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Why was he doing this? What did he want from her? She wasn't young or polished. Her hands were calloused, her skin sun-scarred. And she had baggage, literal and figurative, in the form of 3 chickens and a trail of hardship trailing from Boston to here. 250, Ezra said softly, like it was just a number, not a lifeline. Slade's jaw clenched. He leaned forward in his saddle. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "That one comes with ghosts." Ezra didn't even blink. "So does everyone worth saving," he replied. Clara swallowed a sob. No one had said she was worth anything in a long, long time. Not since her father's gambling spiraled out of control. Not since she lost everything in Boston. But this stranger, this rancher with dirt on his boots and steadiness in his voice, had said it out loud in front of everyone. Worth saving. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Hartwell's hand trembled slightly as he looked down at his clipboard. "Sold," he croaked. $300. Paid in full. Ezra stepped forward, dropped a worn leather pouch into the man's hands. It clinked with the unmistakable weight of gold coins, and turned to Clara. She remained seated, her body frozen, her hand still clutching the basket like it anchored her to this earth. "Come on," he said quietly, extending a hand. Clara didn't move. She stared at it like it might vanish. "Name's Ezra McKinnon," he added. "I've got a ranch, needs cleaning, and someone who knows how to manage hens. If you're willing, you'll get fair pay and a bed to sleep in. No catch." The word willing echoed in her skull like a prayer. No one had asked her what she wanted in so long. She glanced at her chickens. Amora clucked, tilting her head at Ezra's boots. Clara placed her hand in his, rough palm to rough palm, and let him help her to her feet. She wasn't sure if she was walking toward salvation or just another kind of cage. But for once, she was choosing to walk. They stepped down from the platform, side by side, Clara clutching her basket close, Ezra walking at a respectful distance. The crowd made room for them, whispering behind hands and hats, watching the rancher and the woman with the chickens disappear into the dusty street like characters from a parable no one fully understood. Slade didn't follow, but Clara felt his eyes burning into her back. The gold tooth didn't glint now. It stayed hidden behind lips pressed tight with humiliation. That wasn't over. Men like him didn't forget defeat. But for the first time in months, Clara wasn't being dragged. She wasn't being sold. She wasn't being pitied. She had stood, taken a stranger's hand, and walked off the stage on her own 2 feet. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was movement. And that was something. At the edge of the square, Ezra paused. "You'll ride with me," he said. "Saddle's wide enough." Clara nodded slowly. She adjusted her grip on the basket, one hen peeking out. The 3 of them climbed onto the mare, and as the horse turned toward the hills, Clara looked back one last time at the town that had tried to reduce her to a number. She wasn't a number. Not anymore. The journey to Ezra McKinnon's ranch stretched longer than Clara expected. Not in miles, but in anticipation. She sat behind him on the mare named Daisy, one hand clutching her basket of hens tightly to her side. Philo occasionally poked her head out of the loosely fastened lid, squawking in protest at every jolt in the trail, while Carijo and Amora rustled in the straw below. Clara said little, unsure of how to act around the man who had bought her debt but treated her like a partner instead of property. Ezra didn't make conversation for conversation's sake. A few remarks here and there about the trail, or how the weather had been shifting, but there was no awkwardness in his silence. When they finally crested a ridge and the land dipped into a quiet green valley, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was no grand estate like those she'd seen in Boston, not even close, but the place was alive in a way that cities never were. A small log cabin rested near a stream, smoke curling from its chimney. A red barn leaned slightly with age, and chickens pecked along the yard. Cattle grazed in a pasture beyond the fence, It was all so simple, so undemanding, and somehow it felt like possibility. As they dismounted, Ezra extended his hand again, just like he had at the auction. Clara hesitated, then took it, allowing him to help her down. She adjusted her basket, then lowered it carefully onto the porch. Immediately, Philo jumped out and strutted down the steps like she owned the place. "Well," Ezra muttered, watching the hen explore, "looks like she's making herself at home." Clara smiled faintly, surprised by the warmth blooming in her chest. Amora and Carijo followed soon after, circling Clara's skirt before joining Philo near a patch of grass. "They've been with me since Mama passed," she said softly, not quite sure why she felt the need to explain. "They're good layers. Don't bite unless provoked." Ezra nodded, expression unreadable but not unkind. "Every good ranch needs hens. Mine have been gone a while now. Coyotes. These three'll be safe here." He motioned to the yard. "Barn's got a crawl space under the porch, perfect for roosting." Clara followed his gaze, her eyes landing on the shadowy nook beneath the weathered barn. It looked dry and quiet, more than enough for 3 hens. For the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar. Safety. Not the illusion of it like in Boston's parlors, but the real kind. The kind you earned and kept and defended. Inside the house, the warmth was less inviting. The room was cluttered, worn, and smelled of loneliness more than dust. Dishes lay scattered on the table, and boots were kicked off haphazardly near the hearth. Clara stood just inside the door, basket in hand again now that the hens had ventured off. Ezra cleared his throat as he removed his hat and set it on a hook. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, "and it ain't been properly cleaned since, well, in a while. I'm not much for housekeeping." Clara stepped further in and glanced around. "It's a roof. That's more than I had yesterday." She didn't mean it bitterly, she meant it honestly. Ezra pointed toward the stairs. "There's a room up there, belonged to my daughter. You can sleep there if you want. I haven't touched it since." He didn't finish the sentence, and Clara didn't ask. "You're not bound to stay," he added, turning toward her. "If you want to go, I won't stop you. If you stay, I'll pay fare. Room, board, and wages. You'll work but not for nothing, and you'll answer to no man but yourself." The words hung between them, heavier than any silence. Clara had been many things in the past year, but never that, never free. Clara set her basket down again and removed her bonnet. Her hair, thick and golden, fell messily around her shoulders. "I don't know much about cooking or cleaning," she admitted. "Back east we had people for that." Ezra didn't blink. "You'll learn, so did I. When I first came out here, I couldn't tell a plow from a fence post. My wife, Martha, taught me most of what I know. Since she passed, I've been getting by, not doing well." He looked at the fireplace, at the cold ash and the pans stacked beside it. "I could use someone who cares enough to try." Clara chewed her lip. It wasn't the offer she expected. He wasn't asking for obedience or gratitude. Just help. Just effort. "I'll do what I can," she said, her voice quieter. "And if it's not enough, you'll say?" Ezra nodded. "Straightforward's the only way I know." The hens clucked outside, and Clara heard their soft feet on the porch. For some reason, the sound grounded her more than anything Ezra had said. She looked down at her hands, cracked, red, trembling, and then back up. "Then I'll stay," she said, her voice firm now. "At least for a while. See what I'm worth when no one's measuring me by debt." He carried her few belongings upstairs, showed her where they kept the wash basin and the woodpile, and even pulled an extra quilt from a cedar chest. "Winters up here come faster than you'd think," he warned. Clara watched as he moved through the house, efficient but never abrupt. He didn't hover or instruct, didn't try to explain how to be useful. Instead, he offered the space for her to discover it. Downstairs, she took time to wipe the kitchen table clean with a rag she found folded behind the stove. She set her hens up with a shallow dish of water near the back step, watching them scratch and peck like they'd been born on that patch of dirt. There was something oddly reassuring about the way they adapted, completely unbothered by the change of scenery. "They'll start laying again soon," Clara said, half to herself, half to Ezra as he passed behind her with firewood in his arms. "They go quiet when they're stressed." He paused. "Makes sense. People do, too." She turned to look at him. and for the first time their eyes met without weight or caution. There was no need to explain further. That evening, after supper, simple beans and cornbread, Clara stepped out to the porch. Her hens had found their way beneath the barn and were already settled in. Carijo dozed with her head tucked under one wing, while Amora pecked lazily at a bug near the step. Philo, always the most watchful, perched like a sentry on the porch rail, blinking toward the house. Clara exhaled and sat beside her, blanket draped across her shoulders. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe she'd fail at everything. Maybe Ezra would grow tired of her mistakes. Maybe someone from her past would show up and drag her back into the shadows she'd been running from. But for now, the porch felt safe. The hens felt safe. Her breath didn't feel so shallow, and her heartbeat didn't race the way it used to. Ezra stepped outside briefly, leaned on the post beside her, and simply said, "They like it here." Clara nodded. "So do I." It wasn't a promise, not yet. But it was the beginning of one. And as the hens shifted into sleep and the last light faded from the sky, Clara, for the first time in her life, felt like she belonged somewhere, not because someone allowed her to, but because she chose to. For the first time, Clara felt she owned herself. The screaming started with the chickens. Clara was in the kitchen, scraping the last of the beans into a pot, when Philo burst through the open back door, wings flapping wildly, followed by Carijo and Amora, feathers in full disarray. Something was wrong. Then she smelled it, sharp, acidic, and unmistakable. Smoke. She ran outside, her apron still tied, and saw it. Orange light licking at the side of the barn, climbing fast. "Ezra!" she screamed, clutching Philo in her arms as the other hens circled her legs in a frenzy. Ezra came sprinting from the pasture, his fencing tools forgotten mid-task, eyes locked on the growing inferno. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't speak. He grabbed 2 buckets from the side of the house and bolted toward the stream. Clara didn't hesitate either. She stuffed the hens back into the kitchen, slammed the door shut behind them, and took off after him, snatching the largest soup pot from the stove as she ran. When she reached the barn, neighbors were already appearing. Tom Bradley and his sons from the North Ranch, Mrs. Lister from across the ridge, drawn by the glow and the danger it posed. The community wasn't rich, but they understood fire, and they understood what it could take from a man. Buckets passed hand to hand as the flames roared louder, feeding on the old dry wood like it had been waiting years for this moment. Clara fell into line beside Mrs. Lister, her arms aching as she filled and passed, the wet hem of her dress slapping her calves with every move. Ezra barked orders, efficient, calm, and hoarse, but no one challenged him. It was his barn, his land, and his fight. The heat blistered her skin and smoke bit into her lungs, but Clara didn't falter. Not even when sparks caught her sleeve and Ezra slapped them out with a gloved hand. Not even when Tom yelled, "It's spreading to the loft!" and panic swept through the line. She kept moving, kept fighting, because that barn wasn't just a building. It held the winter feed, the tools, the old plow Ezra had spent weeks fixing. It was survival, and if it went up in smoke, they'd be one step closer to losing everything they were trying to build. Clara didn't think about the risk. She thought about the way Ezra had spoken to her since she arrived, like she mattered. And now, for the first time, she felt like someone who could give something back. She wasn't dead weight. Not anymore. When the fire finally began to die, helped more by a shift in the wind than their buckets, the barn was a blackened skeleton. The roof had collapsed inward. The hay was gone. But they had saved the house, the animals, the outer fences, and no one had died. Ezra collapsed beside the stream, coughing into his sleeve, soot streaking his face. Clara dropped beside him, her arms trembling so badly she could barely hold herself up. She leaned back on her elbows, breathing in short, dry bursts. Her dress was torn, her hair caked in ash, but her eyes were clear. "You did good," Ezra said between coughs, his voice almost gone. "Better than most." Clara didn't answer at first. She didn't know what to say. The man who had rescued her had needed rescuing tonight, and she hadn't failed him. That meant something. It had to. "Who would do this?" she asked finally. Ezra didn't reply right away, but Clara saw the name in his expression before he said it. Slade. That one word was a whole curse. And a warning. He didn't need proof, not yet. But everyone knew the kind of man Jeremiah Slade was. Fire was just the beginning, not the end. The next morning, Clara rose early, muscles stiff, fingers blistered, but mind sharp. The chickens had survived. She found them huddled behind the woodpile, jittery but unharmed. She made them a new nest out of old linens, set them out a dish of water, and fed them the last of the kitchen scraps. When she stepped outside, the yard was already alive with people. Tom was back with tools. Mrs. Lister brought coffee. Ezra stood by the wreckage, speaking in low tones with two ranchers she didn't recognize. Clara didn't wait for instructions. She fetched a broom, started sweeping debris away from the house. When she passed one of the ranchers, he nodded. "You Ezra's girl?" he asked. "I'm Clara," she said, holding his gaze. "I work here, and I'm not afraid of a little ash." He grinned and got back to work. It was subtle, but she felt it, a shift in how they looked at her. Not like a burden, not like a tag-along, but like one of them. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her dress was still ripped, her hands still raw, but no one was talking about how she got there. They were talking about what she did, and in a place like Calico Junction, that meant more than any past could erase. By midday, she had cleared the porch, resorted the tools that had been tossed in panic, and even patched the chicken coop with leftover boards. Ezra approached her with 2 tin cups, one full of weak coffee, the other of cool water. "Didn't expect you to be the kind that stuck around after a fire," he said. Clara accepted the coffee. "Didn't expect I'd have anywhere to stick to," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "You're different than I thought." She looked him dead in the eye. "So am I." There was no need for thanks. They both knew what last night had meant. Not just saving the barn, but saving something in her, in both of them, that had been close to burning out. As they drank side by side, Amora wandered past, then Philo, then Cariho, all three resuming their usual patrol of the porch like the world hadn't nearly ended 12 hours ago. Ezra chuckled. "They really do follow you around like family." "They are," Clara said simply. He didn't laugh this time, just nodded, as if he understood exactly what that meant. And maybe he did. Maybe it wasn't about blood or contracts or names on a paper. Maybe family was just who showed up when it mattered. The rest of the day passed in quiet reconstruction. No one talked much about Slade, though his name hovered in every pause. Clara didn't ask Ezra what he planned to do about it. She had learned quickly that Ezra only moved when he was sure. But she saw it in the way he handled the hammer, the way his jaw clenched every time someone mentioned the loft going up so fast. It hadn't been lightning. It hadn't been carelessness. Someone had lit that fire, and they'd meant to hurt. But whatever they'd hoped to destroy, they'd failed. Because Clara stood taller today than she ever had. Not because anyone told her to, but because she'd earned it. She hadn't run. She hadn't waited for rescue. She'd fought. And when Philo laid an egg on the porch just before dusk, Clara took it gently in her palm and smiled. A small thing, but also everything. A sign that something could be salvaged, even after ruin. Life went on. The hens clucked peacefully beneath the steps. Ezra worked beside her without asking her to leave, and Clara, once bought, once afraid, now moved through this place as someone with something to lose. And that, in itself, meant she finally had something to fight for. The storm rolled in without grace, tearing across the valley with winds that rattled window panes and hurled ice against the roof like buckshot. Inside the cabin, Clara paced restlessly near the fireplace, her arms crossed tight around her chest, while Ezra stoked the flames with practiced calm. The chickens, Philo, Cariho, and Amora, had been brought in hours ago, their coop buried under thick layers of snow. They now huddled in a makeshift pen near the hearth, occasionally clucking or rustling straw, completely unaware of the emotional storm brewing in their keeper. Clara had held it in too long. The fear, the past, the name she hadn't spoken in months. As the wind screamed outside, she finally turned to Ezra. "My name's not Clara DeWitt," she blurted. Ezra didn't look up, just paused mid-stir. "I figured," he said, quiet but not surprised. She stared at him. "How?" He set the poker down and leaned back in the chair. "Because no woman from Boston talks about laying hens like their kin." She gave a sad laugh, then sat down across from him. It's Eleanor Blackstone. I changed it when I ran. There's no record of Clara DeWitt before the train to Calico Junction. Not because he was judging her, but because he knew whatever came next mattered more than any label she'd worn. Clara took a long breath and began. I worked as an accountant in Boston, for the Whitmore Foundation. I wasn't high up, but I was sharp. I caught some irregularities in the books. Few donations that didn't add up. She looked down at her hands, ashamed. I brought it to my supervisor. Thought I was doing the right thing. Within 2 days, the files were gone, my access revoked, and I was being accused of embezzlement. Her throat tightened. They pinned it on me. Said I doctored the records, but I hadn't even touched them. Ezra's brow furrowed, not in disbelief, but in anger. Clara continued. The man behind it all was Charles Whitman, head of the board, powerful, respected, and my fiancé at the time. Ezra's posture shifted at that. He framed you? She nodded. When I confronted him, he said I'd ruined his career by snooping. He offered to make it disappear if I married him quietly and never spoke of it again. Ezra's jaw tensed. So you ran. She met his eyes, unwavering now. Yes, I ran. And I've been running since. Ezra didn't speak, didn't move. Clara feared the silence more than shouting. You hate liars, she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I hate people who take without paying for it, Ezra said evenly. You didn't do that. Clara's chest lifted, almost in disbelief. You believe me? He finally looked her in the eye. A woman running with 3 chickens and no shoes doesn't strike me as someone stealing from a charity. Relief flooded her so quickly she had to sit back. The law's still after me. Or they will be if Whitman stirs the pot again. He's got friends in high places. Ezra nodded slowly. Then we'll make sure you stay out of reach. She blinked. We? Ezra rubbed his hands together. If you're under my roof, you're under my protection. You work hard. You don't lie for gain. That's enough for me. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not just gratitude, but something fiercer. Trust. And it terrified her, but it also gave her strength. Ezra wasn't just tolerating her presence. He was standing beside her, in truth and in risk, and that changed everything. The snow fell harder that night. They were trapped indoors, unable to reach the barn, the stream, or even the chicken coop. But the isolation, rather than drive them apart, pulled them closer. Meals were simpler, boiled potatoes, eggs, bread toasted over flame. Conversations were deeper. Ezra told stories of his time in Dakota Territory, of Martha, his late wife, and their little girl who hadn't survived the fever. Clara listened, asking questions not because she was being polite, but because she wanted to understand the man who had offered her safety with no strings attached. In return, she shared more than she'd ever planned to. Tales of Boston, of parties where masks were more than just for the face, of how women like her were always just one mistake away from ruin. The chickens, oblivious to human trauma, became comic relief. Philo once knocked over a teacup. Carrie Jo tried to peck at the curtains. Amora somehow found her way into Clara's knitting basket and refused to come out. Their presence reminded both Ezra and Clara that life, messy, loud, inconvenient life, still carried on. Even in hiding, even under threat. The cabin, cramped and crowded, became not a prison, but a crucible. One night, as they sat by the fire, Ezra handed Clara a folded piece of paper. It's blank, she said, confused. It's for you, he replied, in case you want to write down your real story, not the one they gave you. The one you lived. Clara stared at the page for a long time. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Ezra shrugged. Start with the chickens, that's how you got here. Clara smiled, the first real one in days. You think they're the heart of it all? Ezra took a sip of his drink. I think they kept you alive when nothing else did. And I think they brought you here for a reason. The room was quiet after that. The kind of quiet that didn't need breaking. Clara looked over at Philo, who was perched atop a crate like royalty, feathers fluffed, head cocked. She's got attitude, Ezra muttered. She reminds me of you. Clara nudged him with her elbow. That's supposed to be a compliment. You decide, he said, smirking. It was the closest they'd come to flirting, and it was enough. There was no need to rush something real. Not now. not with everything still looming, but a door had opened, just enough to let in something more than fear. By the third day, the storm began to ease, but Clara still felt the weight of uncertainty. The danger wasn't gone, just paused, yet something inside her had shifted. For months she had lived like a shadow, cautious, quiet, never letting anyone too close. Now Ezra knew her worst truth, and he hadn't turned away. He had stayed, listened, believed. That was something even her own family hadn't done when the scandal first broke. Clara fed the hens that morning with steady hands, watching as Philo strutted proudly around the cabin floor. Amora clucked softly behind her, while Carajo scratched at a rug like she was preparing for battle. These creatures, ridiculous and stubborn, had become more than pets. They were family. Just like Ezra had said. As she returned to the fire, where Ezra sat mending a broken harness, she spoke with quiet conviction. "I'm done running." Ezra didn't look up. "Then let's build something they can't tear down." And that was it. A pact. A shared defiance against the past. The storm outside was fading, but the real test was yet to come. Still, Clara felt more prepared now than ever before, because for the first time she wasn't facing it alone, and neither were the chickens. It started with dust. 3 riders on horseback kicking up dirt as they approached the McKinnon ranch with a kind of practiced authority that made Clara's stomach tighten. From the kitchen window, she saw them before Ezra did. Wide-brimmed hats, polished boots, and shiny badges that didn't glint quite right in the sun. Her gut spoke before her head did. "Ezra," she said, loud enough to carry, "we've got trouble." He stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, eyes narrowing. "Marshals?" Clara shook her head. "Actors, more like." Without waiting for instruction, she crossed the room and pulled the rifle from its mount above the door. Her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. The chickens scattered at the movement, Philo letting out a loud cluck of protest as Carajo and Amora bolted behind the stacked firewood near the stove. Clara looked down at them. "Stay low, girls," she muttered, loading the rifle. Ezra glanced at her as he stepped beside her, quietly impressed. "You planning to greet them alone?" She didn't smile. "Only if they're stupid enough to knock." The horses stopped at the edge of the porch. One of the men dismounted and approached like he owned the land. Clara swung the door open before he could raise his hand. The man standing at the door had the smug certainty of someone used to taking what he wanted. His mustache was too neat, his boots too polished for real law work. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Marshal Reed. We're here for a fugitive reported on this property. Woman, late 20s, blonde, bit heavy-set." Clara didn't move the rifle from his chest. "You bring a warrant?" He didn't flinch. Not needed when the subject's a known fugitive. Ezra stepped beside her now, arms folded. "Funny. Law I know says different." Reed's jaw twitched. "Don't interfere, sir. We have authority to search." Clara cocked the rifle slowly, deliberately. "You'll need to go through me." That earned a laugh from one of the men on horseback. "You don't scare easy, do you?" Ezra's tone cut through the tension. "She doesn't scare at all. But I'd be worried if I were you." The marshal didn't catch the shift in tone. Not until a soft voice behind him said, "Neither of you should move." Dr. Hayes stood there, shotgun in hand, having circled from the barn path unnoticed. "Drop the act, Reed," the doctor said. "I patched up real marshals. You're not them." The man's posture finally cracked. Clara kept her aim steady. The wind picked up, but it wasn't nature's fury that filled the air. It was reckoning. The moment spun like a coin in the air, tension so thick it could have snapped. Reed looked to his men, calculating. But whatever plan they had unraveled under the calm, lethal eyes now surrounding them. Clara stepped forward, closing the distance just slightly, barrel still trained. "I know who sent you," she said coldly. "Charles Whitman doesn't have enough spine to come himself, so he sent dogs." Reed chuckled dryly. "Lady, you've got no idea who you're dealing with." "Wrong," Clara replied. "You've got no idea who I am now." At her side, Ezra remained still as stone, but his presence spoke volumes, an anchor behind her strength. Hayes moved in from the rear, steady and unshaking. 3 on 3. "Not good odds for liars," he said. Reed's hand twitched near his belt. Ezra caught the motion. "Don't," he warned. "You won't clear the leather." The standoff snapped when one of Reed's men drew too fast. Clara fired first. Her shot hit the porch rail, close enough to jolt the shooter off rhythm. Ezra fired next, grazing the man's arm. Hayes's blast took the third rider's hat clean off, sending him scrambling for cover. Reed shouted, backing toward his horse. "We're not done," he yelled. "No," Clara said, lowering her rifle. "You are." Dr. Hayes checked one man's shoulder, muttering that the graze wouldn't kill him but might teach him a lesson. Ezra stood guard as Clara wiped down the rifle, hands steady despite the adrenaline still pumping. "You shot at a man," Ezra said, not with judgment, but with gravity. Clara met his eyes. "He aimed at what's mine." He nodded, clearly understanding more than he said. Hayes joined them, brushing dirt from his coat. "I got a letter weeks ago from an old friend in Boston. Said there might be trouble coming for you, Clara. I didn't know the full story, but I figured you'd earn someone watching your back." Clara's expression softened. "You're a doctor, not a gunslinger." Hayes smiled wryly. "Men like that don't get to write the ending." The three stood in silence for a moment, until the soft clucking from the corner reminded them of the rest of the household. Philo cautiously peeked her head from under the cabinet, followed by Carijo and Amora, who looked none too pleased with the sudden violence. "They okay?" Ezra asked. Clara nodded. "Shaken, not stirred." Hayes laughed. "You've got guts, girl." And chickens with attitude. A few bullet holes in the porch, a cracked window pane, and a deeply shaken sense of safety, but no lives lost. She set about baking bread, an odd gesture for a day that nearly ended in bloodshed but necessary. Something normal, something grounding. Hayes offered to help, but fumbled so badly with flour that even the hens seemed amused. Carijo tried to peck at the bag, while Amora hopped onto the table until Clara gently pushed her off. "No eggs until you earn your keep," she teased, patting Philo on the head as the hen roosted quietly nearby. Hayes glanced around and said, "You know, I think they'd fight for you too if they had fingers." Clara smiled faintly. "They already do enough." They stayed. That was the thing, wasn't it? The staying. Ezra had stayed. Hayes had shown up. Even the chickens in their feathery chaos hadn't abandoned her. Clara cleaned the rifle and placed it back where it belonged. The storm was far from over, but they'd faced this one, and won. As Ezra returned with the sheriff's deputy behind him, Clara stepped onto the porch with her head high. The day ended with silence. Not the uneasy kind, but the earned kind. Ezra stabled the horses while Hayes packed up his things, promising to check on them in a few days. The three false marshals were now prisoners of the law they had pretended to serve, and word would surely reach Whitman that his hired hands had failed. But Clara didn't think about Boston tonight. She thought about the people who'd stood beside her, rifles drawn and hearts steady. She stood on the porch, watching the chickens re-establish their pecking order with amusing seriousness, and let herself breathe. Ezra joined her, arms folded, gaze fixed on the horizon. "You scared me today," he said. "You too," she replied. "Not because you aimed a gun, but because I saw what it means to have something worth protecting." Ezra gave a slow nod. "You've got a home now, and a voice." Clara looked out across the land, hands resting on the wooden railing. "I don't plan to lose either." And with that, the night fell gently, bringing with it the knowledge that the ranch, and everyone on it, feathered or not, had survived again. The hens settled in the corner, still jumpy but safe. The standoff had ended, and the ranch had been saved. 6 months had passed since gunshots echoed through the McKinnon Ranch, and the Clara of today barely resembled the woman who had once trembled on an auction platform with a basket of chickens at her feet. Her hands, once uncertain, now moved with confidence as she adjusted the final seams of her wedding dress, a soft cream fabric borrowed from a neighbor and tailored by her own determination. No pearls, no lace, no pretense, just strength stitched into every fold. Vilo strutted across the yard behind her, followed by Carillo and Amora, their feathers fluffed like they too sensed the day's significance. Clara had become part of the land, of the people, of something real. Ezra watched her from the porch, arms folded, quiet pride in his eyes. "Never seen a bride hem her own dress the morning of," he called. Clara grinned, her blonde hair shining under the morning light. Never seen a groom polish his boots with spit either. But here we are. Their banter flowed easily now. The language of people who had suffered separately and healed together. What they were building wasn't born of rescue or desperation. It was forged in choice. And that, Clara thought, was everything. The morning unfolded peacefully until a dust-covered carriage rolled up the drive, a vehicle too fine for the rugged roads of Calico Junction. Clara paused, instinct flaring. Ezra stepped beside her, protective but calm. The door opened and out stepped a woman draped in somber silk and elegance aged by grief. "Mrs. Whitman," Clara whispered, stunned. "Margaret," the woman corrected gently. "I came alone." Clara didn't speak. Not yet. Margaret approached slowly, glancing down at the hens as if their presence somehow softened the tension. "They're charming," she said, nodding awkwardly toward Philo, who pecked at her boot. Clara couldn't help it. She let out a short laugh. "She likes expensive shoes." Margaret took a breath, then extended an envelope. "This is for you, proof of your innocence, bank records, letters, statements. I spent the last months retrieving everything Charles buried. He's fled the country. The law may never catch him, but the Foundation Board has expelled him. And you're free now, Clara." Ezra looked at Clara but said nothing. The moment wasn't his to speak in. Clara stared at the envelope in her hands. Everything she had once lost, her name, her honor, her past, now sat within paper folds that trembled ever so slightly. Clara's voice wavered, not with fear, but with exhaustion. "Why?" she asked. "Why now?" Margaret's gaze was steady. "Because I raised a man I didn't truly know. And because I saw what he did to you only after it was too late. I may never earn your forgiveness, Clara, but I will carry the shame until I die." Clara looked at her for a long moment, weighing that confession like precious ore. Then with careful fingers, she tucked the envelope into her bodice. "Thank you," she said. "But this wedding still goes on, not because I'm free now, because I was free the day Ezra asked me to stay." Margaret nodded. "Then I'll go." But Ezra surprised them both. "You'll stay," he said firmly. "You came here with truth. That earns you a seat." Margaret blinked, emotions rippling through her stoic expression. "Then I'll stand in the back." Clara placed a hand gently on Margaret's arm. "No, you'll sit with the others. Today there's no front or back, just people who chose right." That settled it. The past would not crash this wedding. It would be acknowledged, folded into the present, and then left behind, where it belonged. Clara exhaled, shoulders lighter than they'd felt in years. As guests began to arrive, the yard filled with chatter, laughter, and the soft clucking of hens wandering among boots and skirts. Ezra had fashioned a simple archway out of scrap wood and wildflowers, and Clara walked toward it barefoot, holding not a bouquet, but the satin ribbon from her old bonnet, the one she'd worn the day she arrived. Around her, neighbors who once watched from a distance now came close with gifts, handshakes, and warm words. Even Dr. Hayes made a speech before the ceremony, raising his glass with a grin. "To the woman who showed us what grit looks like, and to the man who saw her clearly from day one." Ezra squeezed Clara's hand, whispering, "You're glowing." She rolled her eyes. "It's sweat. I was wrangling chickens 2 hours ago." He laughed. "Marrying a rancher has its perks." At that, Philo let out a loud cackle near the altar, drawing a wave of chuckles from the crowd. Amora and Carillo had taken residence under one of the benches, comfortably nestled among flower petals and crumbs dropped by distracted children. The ceremony began with no pomp, just words exchanged under the open sky, surrounded by people and poultry that had shaped their strange and beautiful life. When it came time for vows, Clara spoke first. "You found me when I was broken and didn't try to fix me. You just made space for me to breathe. That space became a home, and now I give you mine." Ezra answered in kind. "You weren't broken, just buried. You dug yourself out. I just held the light. There were no dry eyes, not even among the men who claimed otherwise." Clara laughed mid-cry, dabbing her cheeks. "Damn it, Ezra. I told you I wasn't going to cry." He grinned. "I lied about my boots, too. Margaret polished them." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then, as if perfectly timed, A familiar squawk cut through the emotional swell. Philo, standing defiantly in front of the altar, had laid an egg right then and there. Guests gasped, then applauded. "She's blessing the marriage," Hayes called out. In her own way, Clara bent down, cradled the warm egg in her hands, and looked into Ezra's eyes. "That has to be a good sign." He nodded. "That's the start of a dynasty." They kissed, simple and slow, while the hens clucked approvingly around them. As the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows over the land that had become hers, Clara stood on the porch and looked out at the guests mingling, laughing, drinking cider in tin cups. Margaret sat quietly beside Dr. Hayes, feeding crumbs to Amora while Carajo dozed under a bench. Ezra brought out a pie Clara had baked herself, still warm and smelling of cinnamon. Philo rested beside the steps, feathers fluffed and proud, as if she alone had orchestrated the entire affair. Clara looked at the ribbon tied around her wrist, her only jewelry, and smiled. She was not a woman in hiding anymore. She was not a fugitive, not a transaction, not a victim. She was Clara McKinnon now, and she had chosen this life, this man, this home. The accusations were gone. The scars remained, but they no longer dictated her worth. As the evening rolled into dancing and storytelling under lanterns strung between trees, Clara gathered her chickens with a quiet call and led them to the coop, their feet padding beside hers in the dirt. Philo clucked once and hopped inside. Carajo and Amora followed. The past was behind her. Ahead was everything she had chosen, freely, proudly, and on her own terms. If Clara's journey moved you, from dust to dignity, from silence to strength, then saddle up and subscribe to Souls of the Old West. This is just one tale among many, where forgotten souls rise, fight back, and reclaim what the frontier tried to take.